BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday. Welcome to the special bonus episode of Black Box Online Radio. In this episode, I will be discussing the Zodiac Killer Suspect Peter Plante, as well as looking at the book Titwillow by Judith Chapman. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. I would like to let you guys know that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show and the author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. If the Zodiac case fascinates you, be sure to check out the Zodiac Revisited. It's a deep dive into the mystery, with a unique and interesting perspective. The trilogy is available on Amazon, Spotify, and wherever you get your favorite true crime books. And if you enjoy the series, please consider helping out Michael by leaving a 5-star review. Now, every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer here on BBOR called just that, Zodiac Monday. And some of you might recognize the name Peter Plante, as well as the book Titwillow by Judith Chapman, and you'll remember it from some Zodiac Monday discussions. And I told you guys on that program that this is perhaps the only Zodiac Killer book that I've sat down and tried to read, and that I gave up on about 50 pages in. And something about that always bothered me. And I wanted to give this book another chance out of fairness to Judith Chapman, as well as to truly evaluate Peter Plante as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Was Peter Plante the Zodiac Killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69? Well, let's find out. And one more time, I invite you guys to give your feedback in the comments section down below. And I'm also really going to try and be very organized with this episode. I want to lay out the case for Peter Plante as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and then at the end I'm going to give my responses, my rebuttals, and the things that I'm genuinely curious about in regards to challenges to these claims. The first is that Peter Plante was a student at San Jose State University at the time of the Zodiac murders in 1968 and 69. He would have been 20 years old at the time of the Zodiac murders, so that's on the younger side, but there are a few explanations as to how and why somebody so young would have been able to commit these crimes, as well as to make people think that he was older. Peter Plante was studying criminal justice at San Jose State University, and he was also a member of the ROTC and the gymnastics team. Peter Plante was somebody who would go on to develop certain criminal behaviors, as well as perhaps certain violent and destructive tendencies. And this book, Titwillow, is written by his widow. Peter Plante was her late husband, and she makes the very bold claim in this book that he murdered 144 people. Yes, it starts out by talking about the Zodiac Killer. Yes, the Zodiac Killer is in the subtitle of her book, Titwillow, the story of the Zodiac Killer, but she does believe that he committed a lot of murders and he would have been a very prolific serial killer. But after I got over that 50-page hurdle, I was finally able to get to some of the substance and some of the reasons why she was making these claims. Judith Chapman first met Peter Plante when she was 15 and he was 25. They had a 10-year age gap difference, and her brother was actually playing rough, or maybe even harassing her, you could say, and he kicked her in the stomach, and then Peter Plante stood in between them and said, "Don't ever do that to her again, not in front of me," and she took a liking to that. And Peter Plante was a longtime family friend, and 4 years after that incident, she ended up marrying him. Her sister actually called him up and asked her to come over and meet Judith Chapman, and they were dating for 3 months, the 3-month courtship that she refers to in the book, and they were ultimately married when he was 29 and she was 19. And as far as his appearance goes, there is a wedding photo of Peter Plante in the book Titwillow, and he's reportedly 29 in that photo. But I mean, I think he looks like he's pushing 40. It's almost like the D.B. Cooper suspect, Richard Floyd McCoy, 29 years old, but he could pass for 44. He even has gray hair forming on the sides and so on. Maybe it's just me, but I think he looks much older than 29 years old. And this is all 9 years after the Zodiac murders. So the point that I'm getting to is he would have had an older looking appearance, and maybe that's why you're going to find Zodiac killer descriptions of someone who was 25 years old, 30 years old, maybe even as late as early 40s, although early 40s is pushing it for a 20-year-old, and Peter Plante was 5 feet 9 inches tall. The namesake for this book, Titwillow, though, comes from the 1974 Exorcist letter, and all of this stuff about physical appearances has to wait, because this is really the strong piece of evidence. This is really the majority of the claims that Judith Chapman will use to connect her late husband Peter Plante to the Zodiac Killer mystery. It deals with linguistic clues, it deals with handwriting, it's the type of language that Peter Plante used. Because the Zodiac Killer was not only a serial killer, he also wrote letters, ciphers, cryptograms, diagrams, and greeting cards. And she, as his wife, was very familiar with the way he talked and the way that he wrote. So let's look at some of them. Firstly, Titwillow was found in the 1974 Exorcist letter, which begins by saying, "I saw and think that The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever. P.S. signed yours truly." And then he plunged himself into the billowy wave, and an echo arose from the suicide's grave. "Titwillow, Titwillow, Titwillow." And then he says, "P.S. if I don't see this note in your paper, I will do something nasty." So, as far as this reference goes, there is the Mikado reference, Titwillow, 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 but then there's also the Exorcist line, and she claims that he directly told her that The Exorcist was a satirical comedy. She remembered that very clearly because she thought it was such a bizarre thing to say. She thought The Exorcist was a scary movie, and the man she married says that it was a satirical comedy. In 1974, we also have the Badlands card, and this is just the next one that is discussed in the book, because the Badlands card is an unconfirmed communication. Judith Chapman refers to it as a confirmed communication in the book, but mostly it's unconfirmed, although I do believe there's a very high chance that it is from the Zodiac, but it's just in the unconfirmed status. And the Badlands card is the one that says, "Sirs," he believes that the glorification of violence is deplorable, and that he just signs it a citizen. Both the Exorcist letter and the Badlands card refer to movies, and they don't use the name Zodiac. Now, Judith Chapman claims that there are 3 people that can verify that Peter Plante, her late husband and Zodiac Killer Suspect, wrote a letter to the editor about the movie Badlands and signed it a citizen. Her, that would be his mother, and one other person. 3 people can verify that. And again, I'll save my challenges for the end of this episode. So these are some very big linguistic similarities and stories and personal accounts. Now, as far as linguistic similarities and clues go, the Zodiac Killer also wrote his famous 408 cipher. This was not in the 70s, this was in the 1960s. In 1969, after the Zodiac Killer's second crime, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, he wrote a 3-part set of cryptograms, as well as the debut letter, and they were mailed to different newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. And when the cipher was solved, it had a very particular line in it that said, "To kill is the most thrilling experience. It's better than hunting wild game in the forest. It's even better than getting your rocks off with a girl." Peter Plante also used this expression, "getting your rocks off." And there is the final line of the 408 cipher, which has the text that people still have not deciphered to this day. While most of the 408 cipher is in English, barring the misspellings, the final line is called the Z18 code, and this just has a giant mash of letters. But what Judith Chapman believes is that it says, "Before I eat the meth pity." Eat would be spelled E-T-E like a misspelling. and she actually states that Peter Plante was known to have done speed or different types of amphetamines. Even though it says meth, I think from my interpretation of reading her book, it doesn't sound like she can confirm that he did methamphetamines, but he did amphetamines, so I'll even just give her that about her late husband's drug use, and maybe that's what he did. But that's what she believes it says. Before I eat the meth, pity. There's a meaning to the Z18 code. Then, following these crimes and letters that took place in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, we have another letter that comes in 1978, and this is just simply referred to as the 78 letter. It says, "Tell Herb came and I am back with you, I've always been with you," something to that effect. And she believes that this was indeed written by the Zodiac Killer and written by her late husband, Peter Plante. So, those are some linguistic similarities from the letters. And if you do choose to read this book, Titwillow, there are comparisons that Judith Chapman has done, where she has taken her husband's handwriting, late husband's handwriting, and put it next to the Zodiac Killer letters. Sometimes it's letter by letter. Sometimes it's just his words have been cut out of a different letter and pasted on top of the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. And I'm going to be very, very honest with you. I know I said I would save my challenges for the end, but there are these, when she actually takes the full word and places that above the Zodiac Killer's letter, I'm not really seeing a very strong similarity. In fact, I was quite surprised I wasn't seeing any similarity. But when she took them letter by letter and stitched it together to make words, I actually saw some similarities. She also takes her husband's numbers that he has written in letters and looks how the Zodiac Killer wrote numbers and places them side by side. And again, there are some similarities. And this book does have a solution to the Z13 cipher involving his name, Peter S. Plante, but I don't want to give absolutely everything away because I want to be somewhat fair to the writer and also not just share everything from somebody's book here on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, her book is available on Amazon. Another thing that Judith Chapman learned later in life, well after the 1960s though, but she did learn this from her husband, is that you can take a pencil flashlight, tape it to a gun barrel, and use it to shoot in the dark. And he showed her how to do this. And the Zodiac Killer talked about using a pencil flashlight to shoot in the dark during the Lake Herman Road murders. But specifically, Judith Chapman recalls directly about how Peter Plante told her that you need to put the pencil flashlight on the gun barrel and look for the black dot in the center of the light cone and aim for that, and you can shoot straight. The Zodiac Killer detailed this exact message in his debut letter, placing the pencil flashlight, or not the debut letter, this would have been the August 4th, 1969 letter, the Good Times in Vallejo letter. And he would have taped the flashlight to the gun barrel, and then he would shoot in the dark by aiming at the dark circle in the center of the light cone. So that's another similarity between Peter Plante's stories and the Zodiac Killer's story. But the biggest one, the absolute biggest one, is while intoxicated, Peter Plante confessed to her that he was the Zodiac Killer, or the very least, to quote him directly, he got drunk and just started muttering, "I'm the motherfucking Zodiac, I'm the motherfucking Zodiac, I'm the motherfucking Zodiac." And that's what he said. Now, I'm going to mostly accept that her stories are true and accurate. I don't want to just say that anyone is making it up, because somebody took the time to write this book, and they're sharing this stuff, and I honestly don't believe that she is making it up. I don't think that she is fabricating these stories with any ill intent, based on the way that it's written in her book, Titwillow. But I told you guys that I would get to the challenges to Peter Plante as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Now, one thing that really, really stood out to me was 3 people are going to confirm that he wrote this letter, the Badlands card, or that he wrote a letter to the editor about the movie Badlands and he signed it a citizen. That is something that really can only have 2 possibilities, in my opinion, and I would love to know your response. Number 1 is Peter Plante wrote the Badlands card, or number 2, they are mistaken. Because that is something that is so precise It's not just that he made a comment about the movie Badlands. If that were the case, I wouldn't even bring this up. But that he wrote a letter to the editor and signed it a citizen, and there's a Zodiac letter that's written discussing the movie Badlands and signed a citizen. Either they're completely right and he wrote the Badlands card, or they are just gravely mistaken, and that there's some type of misremembering going on. Now, as far as some of these other challenges and issues, I don't doubt that Peter Plante did some bad things. Another story that Judith Chapman tells in the book is that he once asked her to turn off the lights, and she said, "No, not yet." So he pulled out a gun, and he shot the light bulb, just like Homer Simpson would, although years before, maybe he was the first to do that, and she was shocked that he even had a gun, and she wanted to get out of the home, but she was afraid that he would shoot her. I don't doubt that he was a criminal, or that he did some very abusive things, he did some very controlling things. However, that stuff to me doesn't immediately show that it was connected to the Zodiac Killer mystery. Also, using language like getting your rocks off. Well, did the Zodiac Killer make that phrase up, or was that just the common parlance of the time during the 1960s and 70s? Did other people not use that? More importantly, could somebody else not have been familiar with that phrase, getting your rocks off with a girl? So a lot of these linguistic similarities could be explained just because they were normal things that people of certain age groups would have said at the time. And also, the thing, though, about the satirical comedy in The Exorcist, I will give her that one. That's a very strong point, because that's not just a phrase that somebody would use. I think The Exorcist is the best satirical comedy ever. That is an opinion that has been shared. I will completely give Judith Chapman that one. If her late husband did indeed say that, that would be a very strong point. But I said that this is the time for challenges. One thing that you guys might be wondering is, he doesn't seem to resemble the physical descriptions of the Zodiac, the composite sketch, and I mean, I'm not really seeing any facial similarities to that, although the sketch could be somewhat inaccurate. But I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me when I was first reading this book, Titwillow, and the reason why I gave up on it was when I looked at an early section, and it talked about how he was a college gymnast. I told you, at San Jose State University, he was a gymnast, member of ROTC, studying criminal justice, right? Well, as a gymnast, he had to keep his weight at an exact 165 pounds. All of this is in the book Titwillow. And when I read that, I was definitely bothered by that, because the Zodiac Killer was not referred to as somebody who had an athletic body type, a thin, slender, athletic body type like a gymnast, 5 feet 9 inches tall, 165 pounds, and he had to regiment his eating and training around that. The Zodiac was described as somebody who was 200 pounds, beefy but not overly fat, and in other instances, he's also described as built like an offensive lineman, barrel-chested, not athletic, and definitely not someone who is this small. Even the Officer Falk sighting of the Zodiac Killer after the Stein murder does not report someone who was 165 pounds. So we might be dealing with someone who was older, and we might be dealing with someone who was bigger in terms of a body type. And it's not simply that we're going off of eyewitness accounts. We also have the foot impressions from Lake Berryessa when the Zodiac Killer attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, and those were estimated to have come from somebody who was 200 to 225 pounds. So that also doesn't match up with this athletic gymnast from San Jose State University. Moreover, when it comes to the physical descriptions that were shared by Brian Hartnell and Cecilia, according to Judith Chapman in her book Titwillow, Brian Hartnell told the officer that he saw a man who attacked him who was approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall to 5 feet 9 inches tall. Peter Plante was 5'9", right? Well, I don't necessarily recall that statement. What I do recall is that Brian Hartnell told Ranger William White that the guy was 6 foot or better, and Cecilia Shepard also gave her statement where she estimated that he was an inch or two taller than someone who was 5'10", meaning that he was approximately 6 feet tall. So I can also see certain places where Judith Chapman is not exactly fudging the facts, but she's taking some very big liberties when it comes to these types of interpretations. So, my ultimate stance is that I don't think that this guy, Peter Plante, matches the descriptions. And let's not kid ourselves, murdering 144 people is highly improbable. It's not impossible, but it is improbable. And near the end of the book, she tells a story of how he had a shack in the woods or somewhere, and he would lure men over there, telling them stories. I'm just going to be very vague about them, but he told them stories, and then he would murder them and tell somebody, they will not be missed, they will not be missed. And that is a quotation from the Mikado that the Zodiac Killer did indeed use in his letters. They will not be missed, they will not be missed. But, I mean, I have so many doubts about that. Did that really happen, or once again, is somebody confused? Because so much of this could be somebody who is familiar with the Zodiac story and then backtracking. And even if somebody got drunk and said, I'm the motherfucking Zodiac, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were indeed the Zodiac Killer. And certainly, a lot of defense attorneys would point to that and just say that, well, this person was just intoxicated and they were saying a bunch of nonsense. Could that not be the answer to everything? I'll let you decide. So, I think that Peter Plante doesn't match the physical descriptions. I think that the stories about him are somewhat outlandish, and they're also dealing with a little bit of projection, a little bit of overactive imagination, and also this is just not culminating in anything that is hard and definitive and revealing things about the Zodiac Killer. I think that his numbers are very similar to the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. Some of his letters are similar to the Zodiac Killer's handwriting. But even in terms of personality, about somebody who is going to be this type of protector, as well as the kind of guy that's going to shoot out a light bulb because his wife didn't want to turn off the lights. I'm not even necessarily seeing those types of aggression with the Zodiac. His other actions are cold, methodical, and calculating, not overly aggressive and temperamental. So that's just my personal take on the subject. What do you think about that? You can even weigh in the comments section down below, and please give your honest feedback. Let me know what you think about the Zodiac Killer Suspect. And you guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And the images that you're seeing going by on the screen are archived at True Crime Designs. You can find that on Facebook, and I'll include a link to that. And this show comes to you Monday through Friday. And next week, for the Thursday show, I will be starting the Black Dahlia series. I'm looking to do a deep dive into the Black Dahlia murder from 1947. It's something that I've wanted to explore before for this channel, and even though it's an absolutely terrible story, I'm still quite curious about it, and it is an unsolved mystery that has a lot of parallels with that of the Zodiac Killer, and of course there are Zodiac Killer suspects that are also Black Dahlia suspects. And this channel also releases shorts mostly Monday through Friday here on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. My Instagram is blackboxned88, not on TikTok anymore. I got banned from that one. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now. Goodbye.